Welcome to Suffolk Matters, where all of Suffolk County meets the men and women of Suffolk AME. News, opinions, and insights you won't hear anywhere else. Here's your host, the president of New York's largest independent union, Suffolk AME's Dan Leveler.
Welcome to another edition of Suffolk Matters on Walk 97.5 and 94.3 The Shark, where Suffolk County meets the men and women of Suffolk AME. News and views you can't hear anywhere else.
My guest this morning is Rebecca Sanin. She's a legislator in Suffolk County. Good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So, let's start with, I mentioned you're a legislator. Which district do you represent, and what areas is that?
Sure, it's District 16, and so it's parts of Huntington and the northwest part of Brentwood. In Huntington, it's a part of Comac, it's eastern Dix Hills, it's all of Elwood, part of South Huntington, part of Huntington Station, part of Melville, part of West Hills, part of East Northport, and part of Greenlawn, and then the northwest part of Brentwood around Suffolk Community College.
So your district kind of resembles the state of New York in a way, where there is a lot of diversity, different walks of life, different types of people, and therefore different issues, right?
Tremendous diversity, and it's extraordinary the range of issues that I work on just within a day.
Yeah.
What's important to our neighbors, there's certain similarities, certainly, and then there are just tremendous differences in terms of what people need and what people hope for to live their best lives.
And listen, you're no stranger to public service. We know that. We can get into that history a little bit, but let's just talk about, it's been about 4 months now that you're being tasked with representing folks in this way. So,
Sure.
What's it like for you?
It's the privilege of my life every day to be able to be a public servant, to be able to support our employees in Suffolk County, having worked in Suffolk County before and knowing some of the challenges that exist, to be able to go into communities and bring resources from lots of different places.
Sure.
One of the things that I try very hard to do because of my background in human services and because of the work I've done regionally is look at the district and figure out how to draw down additional resources from an environmental perspective, from a human services perspective, supporting our schools, making sure they have what they need, and certainly in a post-COVID environment, making sure the challenges facing our communities are not just being placated. We're not just looking at how do we address symptoms, but how do we fix systems that are broken.
Right. We see sometimes, I think, folks like to put Band-Aids on things.
Yep.
This thing's broken. Let's patch it up real quick. And if everybody stops complaining, we'll go on. But sometimes the thing is broken and a new approach is needed. And so it's good to have folks that are willing to do that work and advocate in that way. And so some of your background, you're president and CEO of the Health and Welfare Council of Long Island. So let's talk about what that is. It's not something we hear about every day, and,
Sure.
and it's good for people to know what.
Yeah, so it's a regional umbrella organization for the nonprofit sector across the island. So we represent and work with hundreds of nonprofits. That's the work that I did in my previous life.
Sure.
Addressing every human service issue from hunger to mental health crisis to the housing crisis, making sure we're advancing policies to improve people's lives, really engaging in disaster planning, making sure we're doing that continuity planning so organizations, which are small businesses, can sustain during crises like COVID, like Superstorm Sandy.
Sure.
And really just doing everything we can to strengthen the sector, which is providing essential services every day to address the needs of families across Suffolk and Nassau County.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm smiling a little bit because, you mentioned two major things that happened so casually because, that's the level you're working at, right? You're addressing these large issues all over the place, and you were addressing large issues. But when you talk about things like Superstorm Sandy,
Yep.
that was life-changing for a lot of people. Things like COVID, globally. There was changes that happened across the planet that are still with us.
Absolutely. Superstorm Sandy is something I'm passionate to talk about because I worked in Suffolk County. I started in Suffolk County in 2012, and right after I started, Superstorm Sandy hit. And just as I was learning county government, all of a sudden we had this crisis that involved multifaceted issues and multiple levels of government, and had to really learn on the job very quickly how to make sure we were addressing the needs. And it really it catalyzed my fascination and my commitment to really engaging in smart disaster planning for government, right? To make sure that we're an island, right? And we need to really be looking at lots of different issues that affect our ability to continue to provide services when there are these challenges.
I think when Sandy hit, it was the first time that it became, public knowledge that, hey, listen, there's only a certain amount of gas on the island.
Yep.
There's only a certain amount of days of food and all of these other things. And because of the way that storm, the path that it took, it blocked shipping lanes. It made it so that, transport of, goods much more difficult. We saw things like, lines for gas,
Yep.
Odd, even license plates, that like all of that stuff. And unless you go through it, you wouldn't necessarily know. So.
And we have to take that lesson and what we learned and
Yes.
understand that these 100-year storms are no longer every 100 years,
Yeah.
and be really strategic and make sure we're planning so we can take care of our employees and take care of our people when another crisis hits. And I say when because it would be ignorant not to acknowledge that this is the
Yeah.
universe in which we're living today.
So AME, the members that I have the privilege of representing, they represent all facets of county government.
Yep.
There's no department that Suffolk County sits over that my membership isn't integral to. And we saw during COVID that whole concept of essential workers, right? And we started talking about those frontline essential workers, and I think they always were, right? My members, folks at the grocery store, all sorts of different job titles and walks of life that, society relies on. But, at a point in time, people were talking about those types of jobs as, entry level
Yep.
or, it's for students or whatever else, and then it became essential. Now we came out of COVID, and you can see some of that language creeping back in, like, oh,
Yep.
it's not essential. I contend that it still is essential work. But in your role in government and in your role in the nonprofit sector, you would interface with some of the folks. We've got hundreds of job titles across all different departments, but you've gotten to experience the AME membership and the work that they do.
Absolutely. And so even in my most recent previous role at the Health and Welfare Council, the LI Fed was a member of our network. They joined our network because I've always felt that it's really important to work hand in hand with labor.
Sure.
Our essential workers, we always use different language, and language has power. But the reality is that the core functions of government are public safety, public health, and social services.
Right.
And these people put their psychological and physical well-being on the line every day to make sure that they are catalyzing public safety, that they are addressing public health, and that they are meeting the needs of our most vulnerable neighbors. They also represent, from my perspective, the economic engine of Suffolk County.
Sure.
Because we often talk about, we talk about infrastructure as being a big part of the economic engine, but the other piece of the economic engine is making sure that people have access to jobs, that people are getting the training they need, that people are getting the food that they need on their table so they can focus on advancement and evolution of their family lives. And so our AME workers that often are called essential workers or entry-level workers, they are the heart and soul of Suffolk County, and they deserve the respect, the honoring, and the salary that matches the work that they do.
Yeah, that's definitely. We're touching on a point when you mention salary and respect. That's close to my heart, right? And at the end of the day, there's been a number of situations you see in the newspaper, we hear about. But I look at some of the data behind the scenes. The news story fits X amount of words, and maybe there isn't room to print all of these details. But when departments are understaffed in these critical functions, it's not that the folks doing the work aren't doing a good job. It's just there are not enough of them. They don't have the resources necessary to get everything done. And to demonize these people, to say, that they made certain choices or they behaved in a certain way that now should be considered criminal, right? I specifically, I talk about social services. I think about the issues over there, and when you have almost 600 vacancies, right?
Yep.
Actual jobs that people are paying taxes for that aren't being filled. And one of the reasons why those jobs aren't filled, it's an incredibly difficult job. It is psychologically demanding, right? You're dealing with vulnerable clients all the time. If you have any heart whatsoever and you're just seeing this day in and day out for
Yep.
decades, it wears on you. But then you're not just doing your job. You're doing the job of the other vacancies that are
Yep.
around, right? There's clerical staff that support people that work in the field, and now the field worker has to do both jobs. Then you have things like policy where, certain decisions were made along the line to say, hey, we don't want our numbers to look like they're high, so close out cases within 15 days. But 15 days isn't enough time to close a case. And on top of that, it's not the only thing you're doing. You're carrying 15-plus cases. So you're working all of these different cases. You're mandated to close them out within 15 days, which means you've got a day a case, if you want to look at it that way, to get everything done. Then we end up with situations where the numbers look great, but is government doing what it's supposed to do? The difference between that Band-Aid and that infrastructure that you're talking
100%.
about, that system that's there to support the people. So,
Absolutely. No, I mean, if I could respond to that.
yeah.
First of all, it's funny, a couple lifetimes ago when I was in college, which feels like a couple lifetimes ago at this point, I had a professor who told me, you hear the rhetoric, you hear the language that people talk about in the news media, always look at the budget. And when you want to know what people value, you look at what they spend money on, right? And we have a responsibility to spend, when we allow what you just described, when we allow people who endure trauma every single day of their work experience, when we allow people who are in the trenches, in many cases being, shedding the only light in a dark situation for families in Suffolk County, when we allow them to make poverty wages, to not be able to feed their own families, to be sometimes the same people that are serving folks and reliant on some of these systems, then we have to look in the mirror and reflect on that. And we have to really think about, what we're doing as a county. I'm a very strong proponent of smart business decisions. And when your essential and core services are hurting in a business, you have no business.
Right.
You have to address those essential and core services first. And when you talk about child protective services, quite frankly, I can't think of a more important mandate than making sure our babies and our children in Suffolk County are safe and have what they need, and our families are being strengthened when they are in crisis.
Right.
And so these people are doing God's work every day. These people are, sacrificing their own psychological well-being and sometimes that of their families in order to do this work. And they absolutely need to be paid appropriately to reflect that extraordinary investment. And the one thing I like to say to folks, because I think sometimes there's this real misconception about what social services is, right? It's social services is what creates economic vitality in Suffolk County. Social services is a huge part of what contributes to public safety. When people have what they need, when their basic needs are met, they're healthier. Their well-being is promoted. It's an economic engine. It promotes public safety. It promotes public health. What we learned in COVID-19 is that when any corner of our community is hurting, it affects all corners of our community. So social services really can be that rising tide that raises all boats that we talk about a lot. But in order for it to be that, folks need to be properly trained and invested in. People need to be properly paid. And we need to be able to have honest conversations that aren't about finger pointing, but are about how do we work together to solve the problems. And system building in social services is not just about bringing experts in and saying this is what we're going to do. It's also about bringing employees to the table and saying, let's learn from you. You folks who are on the ground, teach us also what is working and what isn't working and how we can support you so that they have a voice too.
Sure. We talked about, health and safety as part of the mandate of government. And when you think of public safety, folks think of, an officer in a car, right? But there are many facets of government that go to protecting public safety. And when you talk about social services, desperate people do desperate things, right? Them not being desperate, them having enough to get by and to deal with their situation allows them to problem solve their way through the rest of what they've got to work through.
100%. And the cost saving when you invest in people who are doing this work is extraordinary. From a public health perspective, I'll just give you a very simple idea. When people don't have their basic needs met, all the research shows that about 80% of your health outcomes are a result of social determinants of health, things like food and safe housing and basically meeting your basic needs, right? So when you look at the insane costs that we are spending on medical care in this country and on Long Island alone, right? If we want to reduce that, and this is something that the federal government has invested billions of dollars in at this point, we have to start thinking about how we address those social determinants, make people get their social service needs met so that they can have better health outcomes and so that we are not paying these exorbitant fees. I mean, look at our healthcare costs. Look at it's almost untenable, but there are things that we can do, and a big part of that is invested in people's human needs.
Sure. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I speak to the altruism of the public worker, right? That public employee that comes to work for the government and work on behalf of the community because all of the good that they get to do. And then on top of that, we talk about, I'll call it the dark side of this whole thing. They're not doing it to get rich, right? In a lot of instances, sometimes people are taking these jobs with the understanding that they're going to have a second job.
Yep.
Just to get ends to meet. But the fact of the matter is, by and large, a public employee, whether it's on the town level, the county level, state, federal, all of this stuff, the public employee isn't going to get rich doing the work that they do. What they get out of it is that sense of having helped the world and being part of the solution. I think that's it's just worth noting.
And I think that's why I so appreciate being on your show this morning and the work that you do, because I think across our society, people have lost faith in government. And there's just constant negativity when we talk about government. But what government is a compilation of public servants who come to work every day and do everything they can to make sure when they put their head on the pillow at night, they know they've accomplished something for people and they've made a meaningful difference. And we have so much to celebrate in that and so much to be proud of and to honor our folks for what they do.
So getting into your work a little bit more, especially, I guess we're in committee cycle, coming out of committee cycle, whatever it is, but you sit on various committees at the legislature, and these are, groups of legislators that sit and talk about particular topics and try and work through those issues to advance legislation, to maybe enact laws or policy on the funding side of things to make sure that the best work is getting done. What committees do you sit on, and what type of work do those committees do?
Sure. So I'm environmental, parks, and agriculture, and that's I think that's pretty explanatory just in the name, right?
Yeah.
Looking at our environmental health as a county and as a region, and looking at strategies to improve that. Human services and seniors, which is, of course brings a lot of my expertise to bear, and certainly in that group, and I've said it on the record, what I am really calling for, and I think the administration is very supportive of, is the classification study and looking at salary studies and making sure we're addressing what we've just talked about.
Sure.
Certainly Ways and Means, which is about looking at, I think you understand Ways and Means, right?
Yes. That is a very big one, yes.
Fire, rescue, and emergency services, which is important to me. Our firefighters are volunteers on Long Island and deserve our respect and need to have the resources that they need to continue to serve us. And then the health committee as well, which is certainly since COVID-19, I think, has reinvigorated what needs to be done in terms of looking at not just individual health, but public health and the ways the county can support that.
So a little history about my job. As you bring up the health department, we talk about COVID-19.
Sure.
There was a point in time where things, financially for the government were very tight.
Yes.
And Suffolk County was thinking, you know what, let's get out of the business of health. And we don't need nurses, and why don't we, kind of offload these processes and the whole nine. There was a lot of behind the scenes fighting and arguing, not a lot of stuff hitting the newspaper or anything else. It was one of those situations where it was a quiet fight, let's call it, just a disagreement. And then COVID-19 hit. And everybody involved in the discussion was like, thank God you won the argument, because the fact of the matter is we needed the government side of health just as much as we needed, health industry to work all of this stuff out. But when you look at things like fire rescue and emergency services, I mean, that was huge with Sandy. But there are functions out of fire rescue emergency services. I'll just abbreviate it as FRES. That's what we say all the time. But you've got the fire marshals over there. Sure. You've got dispatch services. So anything, fire or ambulatory is going to go to the FRES call center and have that function dispatched out of that office. So when it comes to potential natural concerning situations like Sandy, or we get into some of these areas where there's fires. We get into areas where there's regulation concerns about, like, how close can this business be to that business? If there is a fire at business A, what will that do to business B and the surrounding area? All of that stuff. And that stuff is constantly being monitored, worked on, regulations put in place, thought about, and discussed at your committee as well. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that we have to do, and not just as a county, but in conjunction with at least Nassau County, if not the larger metro area as well, is start to look at regional planning when it comes to disasters, right?
Smart.
And not just, a lot of times we live in our silos here on Long Island, and we need to really be careful about that when it comes to disasters and the impact of disasters and the way we can engage in mutual aid and the way that we can support each other, and the way that we can be strategic so that the health and welfare of our community is protected. And that involves working with government. It means working with our employees, your members. It means working with the human services community, so that, for example, the Red Cross is ready to go when there's a crisis and there's a sheltering need. But you can't just expect folks to know what they're doing separately in silos. You got to coalition build, bring people together to the table, and make sure we're doing that work. I did some of that work at the Health and Welfare Council. We ran the regional VOAD, which is Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster. It's a national model. We sat on the state board, and then we ran the regional efforts. And that was a lot of the work we did was planning during blue sky times for crisis, right? So that continuity planning is in place.
And now think about the impact that has. I'm always fascinated by the things that people do and how it impacts their lives. But while everything's okay, you've got a group of people sitting down and planning for disaster, putting yourself in the mental headspace of, so that if something does happen, their system's ready to just pop up and start running.
There's nothing better than when a disaster hits, not having to panic and being able to know exactly what your role is, who's deploying what. Everybody has, their strategy, and it's all coordinated. Coordination and communication are the two biggest tenets of really quality disaster work.
And I think, on some level, I think about Y2K, right? And all of the planning that went into that, all the conversations and everything. And then all the work was done, and folks doing what you were doing got it right. And, the clock flipped over and nothing happened, right?
But what a blessing.
Right. Well, yeah, but public, impression could be like, oh, there was never a crisis. Yeah, there was, and it was addressed, it was handled, and it was fixed. So when you do your job really well, you seem like, I think the expression chicken little, like, okay, we're going to, everything,
Absolutely. But that's why, I often say, folks these days, especially in the polarized environment we're in, they talk a lot about politics and, accolades. And the reality is that this work shouldn't be that. At the local level, this is about public service. It's about taking care of our neighbors, and it's about being prepared to do that.
So I'm just gonna circle back again on some DSS stuff, because I'm aware, like, another aspect of my job is to track legislation, not just in Suffolk County, but in the state. And we look at things that are happening on the federal level as well. And we weigh in with all these different groups and try and make sure that the working people's, their perspective is added to the conversation as well. And now there's legislation that's being looked at on the state level to try and, from my perspective, I know I'm coloring the conversation, but I'm doing this on purpose. It's a little knee-jerk. And they're saying, hey, we want to be able to prosecute employees for doing their job. We don't want them to, quote-unquote, hide behind the system. Well, these employees don't have the authority to hide behind the system, right? They don't get to make that decision. The policies are set for them, and if they're told 15 days to close out a case and that's not enough time, they're going to come up with an unfounded designation. The information that could have been shared, it wasn't the workers that decided not to share it. That happens much higher up in, like a lot closer to the commissioner's office than it is to, maybe a field worker's decision. And with that being said, the actual legislation, while it's being touted as, this is going to be a good thing, and we'll have a better handle on what's happening inside of CPS and a better understanding of what's happening to children in general, and we'll have greater control. The actual bill language allows them to go after any public worker for any reason. So that means the people that sit in the bill writing office up in Albany and are in there typing up, a bill like this, and if they miss a comma and that somehow changes the interpretation of the law, which we know, the whole Oxford comma thing. But the everyday worker on any level of government now has to operate in a position of fear that they may be criminally charged for doing their job, right? And now you don't pay them. They don't have enough, materials and equipment to get the job done. They don't have enough support staff or, their own coworkers to get through the whole thing. And the reward for that is maybe you could go to jail. What are we doing when we talk about systems? This is not a Band-Aid. This is a pickaxe. So, and I'm not asking for your opinion on the legislation. I'm clearly sharing mine. And like I said, I know I'm coloring the commentary, but I'm doing so deliberately.
Yeah, and I'll speak generally. Look, I think when we look at Child Protective Services, it's about a larger system. So it's not just CPS, right? Child Protective Services is one piece.
Yep.
When a call gets made by a mandated reporter.
Yeah.
Then there's the court system, right? And we could talk for hours about the court system, right?
I can think about a lot of judges who have, made their decision, they did their job, And then that situation comes back to me in the form of, your people didn't do their job. My people aren't the judge. The judge decided to release somebody or not release
Right.
somebody or whatever. So, yeah.
And I think most people who go into any kind of public service, including our judges, are doing it for, the right reasons with a big heart.
No criticism.
Yeah.
I'm just saying
But I would say, right, so if something happened to me today when I was walking out of here, nobody would ever tell me that I need to re-engage with my attacker. That would never happen.
Right.
Right? But we do this to kids all the time because the best interest of the child model in our court systems a lot of times is about family reunification.
Yep.
Sometimes family reunification is appropriate and sometimes it's not. We don't have a paid for smart therapeutic visitation program. So if a child has to re-engage with a parent who's harmed them, we don't have a system that helps that child and that family reintegrate in a way that is so there's so many gaps. It's not just child protective services is one piece in the wheel. The second thing I would say is when you look at criminalizing people for doing their job, particularly when they are under-resourced, you have a chilling effect on being able to hire. So I think you talked about 600 vacancies, right? It creates a lot more challenge in terms of hiring folks. What happens a lot of times, and I think it's well-intended a lot of times, is that a crisis happens, a tragedy happens, and anyone with a heart feels like, we got to do something. We got to do something quickly. What are we going to do?
Right.
But it's really important to pull back and process. And so, I really, I don't know the complete specifics of the legislation other than what you just shared. I think it's really important to work together, right? And that's the state, that's the county, that's the workers, and that is the other pieces of the child welfare system to say, what can we do that actually makes children safer?
Right.
Because that's the purpose of this.
Yeah. And that brings us back full circle to what it is you do specifically, which is planning in the good times for what's going to happen in the bad times, and having the strength of character to say, hey, listen, I know we have a system. I know we put some Band-Aids on that system. Let's talk about the system anyway.
Yep.
Right? Because another crisis will occur.
Yep.
It's
There's no question.
It's unfortunate to say, but it's not a question of if, but when, right?
100%.
And that's, disaster planning in general.
Absolutely. And at the same time, doing everything we can, again, to strengthen our families in Suffolk County. And our families, in many cases, are made up of your members, Dan,
Sure.
who live in Suffolk County, right?
Absolutely.
Who maybe, are living on these poverty wages and having economic stress in their own families. And economic stress increases child abuse. It increases domestic violence. We know these things. And so if we want to take care of our Suffolk County residents, we have to look holistically at that. And I think certainly when folks are putting their hearts and their lives on the line, we have to make sure that we are treating them with honor and respect. And I'd be open to a conversation with you anytime about things I can do as a legislator to help elevate that.
And, so I guess that's the perfect opening as we're, kind of nearing a close here. The idea of things that you can do as a legislator. And obviously these are conversations I'm having all the time. But since I've got you on the show and we're talking to so many folks this morning, it'd be great to hear from you about things you are looking to do as your priorities, right? There's we've talked about such massive things this morning, again, in such a casual tone. But the fact of the matter is these are very big things. So what are some priorities for you in this session?
Yeah, absolutely. So a big priority is a strategy that I'm planning to talk about in the near future regarding child trauma. And making sure we're doing everything we can to reduce the trauma that kids face when they are exposed to challenges in their home. And there's some models nationally that I'm looking to bring to Suffolk County.
Okay.
I believe very strongly that in Suffolk County and across Long Island, we often work in these silos, and we need to look at what's happening nationally and bring things that are successful here. I'm working in my disadvantaged communities, which are Brentwood and Huntington Station, to address environmental hazards and pollution mitigation strategies, as well as blight, which has a huge impact on public safety. I'm working certainly hand in hand with our police department on some clear public safety initiatives. Sure. On the fire, rescue, and emergency services side, one of the things that I'm trying to do is address public education. So a bill that we're laying on the table this week regards use of fire extinguishers, because what we find is that lots of folks have fire extinguishers but have never had to pick up one and use it.
Right.
If you don't know how to pull the pin and do the process, then you could be in a crisis and suddenly not know how to act. And so requiring folks to post a sign that teaches people how to use the fire extinguishers in all public places, that's something that's important to me. Creating a nonprofit recognition strategy so that all these folks that are doing this work in our communities are also being lifted up. That's important to me. Working on strategies for our aging population in Suffolk County, who often are not thought about when it comes to regional planning. That's really important to me.
Sure.
And making sure that I'm using my public platform. So there's the legislative side, but then there's all the other pieces, which is I have a voice.
Yeah.
And I want to be an advocate at the state and federal level and at the local level to fight for our employees for what they need, to fight for our families for what they need. And I'm very steadfast in my commitment to that. And I've been looking at different strategies to use my platforms to do that.
No, that's excellent. I appreciate you taking your time this morning to use your voice to, kind of speak to us about some of these issues. Like I said, we spoke in somewhat casual terms about some very big things. You're talking about initiatives that I think are very big things. And it's going to take a lot of folks coming together and putting all their very best ideas together and weeding through the difference between, what's possible versus what's probable, right? Anything can happen, but this is most likely what will happen, and weeding through all of that stuff. So it's a lot of work. And I always appreciate the time of talking to people doing this specific work, getting it out there and letting folks hear what the process is. You tend to experience politics through the lens of the media, and they tell the stories the way they do. I think your day-to-day life very much is different than what the media portrays. So.
What I tell people all the time is that the issues that I care the most about should be nonpartisan.
Sure.
And you're absolutely right. It's about bringing people together in coalition and in community with one another to lend their voices and listen to one another and build strategy. And that's something I've done throughout my career, and it's certainly something I plan to do here on the legislature.
So my guest this morning was Rebecca Sanin. She's legislator from the 16th District, and thank you again for joining us. And
My
to
pleasure.
our listeners, we will speak to you next week.